Do you have your priorities straight? Ever been asked that? Or maybe been told by somebody you need to get your life together? Maybe it can happen to that sometimes. Our life kind of gets out of order. We might realize that we spend too much time maybe doing certain things that really are not all that important. Because that's what we mean by priorities. Something that should rank first. Something that's more important than other things that we should give more time to. Though, if we do have to admit that, especially if somebody's pointed out to us, it's not all that fun to have to admit. In the context of our first reading, the people were being told by God through his prophets just this, that their priorities were not correct. They needed to learn to put God first. But the reaction was resistance. And so in there we read, they said, "Let us beset the just one because he is obnoxious to us. He sets himself against our doings." To be told that we're doing something wrong or we need to change something, the messenger can at times feel pretty obnoxious. But sometimes God needs to come and annoy us to get us back on track, to think more and spend more time on those things that are really the most important. So if we take Jesus in the gospel today, he tries to speak to his disciples about something that's very, very important that's coming up. That he's going to be handed over, that he's going to be killed, and he's going to rise again after 3 days. Of course, this is the essential message, the essential act of our salvation. The Savior offering his life for us. But none of them wanted to talk about it. None of them. And to be fair, you can imagine being the disciples. We already know what Jesus means, right? We know what happened. But they didn't know at that point. They didn't understand what he meant. So if somebody would come up to you and, tell you that they knew what was going to happen in their future, that they were going to get killed and then rise from the dead, maybe you'd think they were a little bit crazy and not want to talk to them about it. But the disciples didn't even ask Jesus what he meant. They remained silent. And instead of asking Jesus about his death and rising, which is going to be the most important thing for our lives, the disciples get distracted by other less important questions. They argue about who's the greatest. Does that ever happen to us sometimes? We get caught up in petty things, including comparing ourselves to others, maybe wanting what they have. What we have is not enough, or maybe wanting more than they have. Even if we look at our second reading from St. James, he talks about where jealousy and selfish ambition exists. That's where all this disorder and foul practice comes from. He even says this really is the source of why we have wars and conflicts. It's because we want something that somebody else has. Our priorities are messed up. At the time, maybe those things might seem important to us, but in the bigger picture, they really aren't. Trying to be greatest in the eyes of the world, to have certain things, maybe that others have, and so maybe they're greater than us from our point of view. Jesus says to get those things isn't going to lead us to happiness. It won't really make us great. Instead, greatness, happiness comes when we serve others rather than ourselves. Giving of ourselves for the sake of somebody else, that is what's going to bring us the greatest happiness and fulfillment. And so Jesus uses the example of the child. He says, "Whoever receives one child such as this in my name receives me." Adults giving of themselves generously to others, especially the coming generations, to help them grow, help them know the Lord. That is so much more fulfilling than simply serving our own needs. And in one way, that's exactly how Jesus comes and offers himself for us as his children. Jesus is willing to offer his whole life, even to death on the cross, for we his children. Even when we go astray, even when we get our priorities wrong and we go after all sorts of less important things, like childishly comparing ourselves to one another. Instead, Jesus calls his children to be like him, to give of ourselves out of love for God and for others. So if that's where we place our priorities, then we will be happy. We'll be great. Great like Jesus. Great like the saints.